Hey, detoxers. Welcome to Disinfo Detox, the show that cuts through the lies and scrubs propaganda from public discourse. Today, we're breaking through the corporate news narratives about President Donald Trump's labor policies. Since working class people are basically an endangered species in corporate media, I've invited Caroline Luce to help us understand what's going on with labor in Trump's second term. Caroline is a project director with the University of California, Los Angeles Institute for Research on Labor and Employment and chair of the Communications Committee of UC-AFT. Her research specialty is immigration, labor, and working class culture in the American West. And she is working on a book manuscript entitled Yiddish in the Land of Sunshine, Jewish Radicalism, Labor and Culture in Los Angeles. Caroline, welcome to Disinfo Detox.
Hi, how are you?
Doing well. Always a pleasure to see you. And I want to have you on the podcast today because there is so much going on in Trump's second term, particularly around the National Labor Relations Board. And before we get into some of the stuff Trump has already done in his second term, who he's appointed and who he's fired and who is suing him over the NLRB, I wanted to talk to you first just to kind of remind our audience about what the NLRB is, what some of its major victories are. And I think that'll help us kind of understand why some of Trump's moves have really scared a lot of people in organized labor. So what do you say about that, Caroline?
Yeah, well, it's always important to start discussions of the NLRB with the history, the context, right? So we're talking about the depths of the Depression. By 1932, at least here in Los Angeles, something like 30% of workers were unemployed. As is often the case when there's a contraction in the economy, major employers look to integrate new technology into their workforces. So there were new technologies being put in, and that labor displacement was kind of happening in permanent ways. People were not going to get their jobs back. So President Franklin Delano Roosevelt is elected with a broad mandate in 1932. And in his first 100 days, his first attempt to sort of rein in the excesses of the economy was a previous bill called the oh my God, I'm forgetting the name of the bill. The NRA is what it reduces to, the National Industrial Relations Act, Recovery Act, sorry. What that did was attempt to establish what they called codes of fair competition. So I've actually been to the National Archives and seen the records. They basically solicited recommendations from all over the country about what prices people were paying, what wages people were getting, all sorts of information. And then they set these codes of fair competition for every industry. I studied the garment industry. There were like 400 of them. And this was everything from kind of prevailing wage type things to prices on goods. The Supreme Court, as will not surprise you, said you can't do that. That this Congress does not have the statutory authority to do this. So the NRA is struck down. But folks in the Congress, and this feels like something maybe our current Congress should learn, knew this was going to get struck down. So they had other legislation in place. It was called the National Labor Relations Act, written by Robert Wagner. So it's often called Robert Wagner. He's a senator from New York. It's also often called the Wagner Act. And essentially what this does is, instead of codes of fair competition, it defines a series of unfair labor practices. These included things like prohibiting child labor, firing union members or union workers who were trying to organize a union, blacklists, refusing to hire union members, and all sorts of forms of retaliation. So it enumerates these unfair labor practices, and then it creates a body to enforce those unfair labor practices. That is the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board. There are 5 appointed members. This board has power to overrule local or state NRA boards. And it has prosecutorial power, which is to say they can issue subpoenas, they can issue requests for information, and they can impose legal fines and penalties. The NLRB also functioned as kind of a grievance resolution apparatus for workers, whether they were union or not. So one important thing to keep in mind is that many states don't even have a Department of Labor. They don't have any way, they don't have state level occupation and safety and health committees. So if you're a victim of wage theft, say in the state of Florida, where 25% of low-wage workers are victims of wage theft, your only recourse is the National Labor Relations Board. It's the only body that has the power to adjudicate your claims against your employer. And the NLRB functions as an election supervision body. So it establishes a mechanism through which workers can decide to form a union. Just as a brief overview, that's what's called a card check. So if you get 30% of your workforce to join a union, you can call a card check election. The NLRB will authorize a vote. They'll send the ballots, they administer the election, and if 50% plus of the employees at a given work site vote for a union, that union becomes their collective bargaining agent. So it officially represents them. And then, at least in theory, employers are compelled to negotiate with them. And any shenanigans that happen along the way of that election, which is to say, if an employer commits unfair labor practices leading up to that election, the NLRB has the authority to redo it. One of the things I find remarkable is every time I talk to my students about this, they are like, wait, is that happening? Because basically what has happened in the past 10 or 20 years, some of my colleagues would argue more like 30 or 40 years, is that employers have realized that the NLRB's penalties, right, the fees and fines that they're able to issue are so minor that they can basically ignore them. And one of the contemporary examples here is Starbucks, right? Starbucks has had something like 1,200 different unfair labor practices charges against it. I think at least 50 of those the NLRB has found to the side of employees and basically said, yes, you're committing unfair labor practices. They've closed stores, they've fired organizers, they've done all sorts of things. The NLRB has issued penalties, but those penalties are so small, it'll be like $10,000 fine, that Starbucks will just pay it and move on. But as you gestured at in your introduction, what has happened in recent years, led by Elon fucking Musk, and a bunch of other major anti-union employers, is that they are now challenging the NLRB's statutory ability to issue any penalties or fines at all. So they decided, I'm not even going to ignore or just pay out these small fines over here and over there. I'm going to file a lawsuit that strikes at the very heart of the NLRB abilities to make policy. And that attack is coming part and parcel with a broader attack on what people call the administrative state, right? These are what you might call activist lawsuits challenging the ability of any federal government agency to exercise statutory authority in an administrative function to make rulings without the Congress or the executive branch weighing in on those rulings. The way that these, the EPA was established, the NLRB was established is through legislation granting it authority to adjudicate matters on its own. And it's that independence that they're challenging. And their court case, if it goes through, would mean that the National Labor Relations has no enforcement power whatsoever. So it will exist on paper, but have no, in practice, have no ability to actually issue any penalties and fines. Which strikes at the very heart of our rights as workers across the United States. If you have the right to collective bargain on paper, but your union or your employer can refuse to recognize your union, refuse to negotiate your union because there's no penalty if they do that, then functionally you have no collective bargaining rights.
Okay, yeah, thank you for pointing that out. And I think it's a good jumping off point here, which is the narrative kind of coming out of 2024, some people in media said, the working class is voting for Trump. And I think there was a good critique in there, one that I share about how the Democratic Party has really abandoned organized labor for the last, 30 or 40 years, as you were pointing out. But I have no delusion here that Trump is actually pro-worker. I just think he was smarter about the working class rhetoric, and Democrats have abandoned everything, that they don't even have rhetoric anymore. So let's talk. That's why I want to bring this up, because I want to look specifically at what Trump is doing. I mean, you laid the groundwork on some of this stuff. He's got folks like Elon Musk, who under the auspices of government efficiency is actually just getting rid of any regulatory body that gets in the way of his business and profit motives. So let's talk about the NLRB, because Trump effectively already kind of rendered it inept, because he fired one of the sitting members, and there are very specific laws that's not allowed to be done the way he did it. And because of that, they don't have enough people to have quorum. So the National Labor Relations Board can't even operate. And in the meantime, he appointed William Cowen as the new acting general counsel of NLRB. So given some of these decisions by Trump, to fire a board member, to appoint Cowen, What do you think this portends? What's going to happen with labor in Trump's second term based on what we're seeing here?
Yeah, what's going to happen to labor? I mean, I don't see this. I will just add a dimension here. I don't see this as separate from what they're doing to immigrants right now. People, there's a lot of bluster around mass deportations, and I do not by any means want to imply that that's not horrific. Separating families, pulling people out of schools, attacking churches, harassing children at bus stops. It's just absolutely brutal and disgusting. But I think there's a misapprehension. A lot of times liberals will sort of say, this is a leopard part or leopard face party. I don't know what that turn of phrase is, right? Like, the people are going to see it because we're going to have no farm workers to work in the fields. That's not actually what they want to do. They don't want to remove that labor force. They want to push that labor force all the further underground and into the shadows, right? Because states like California have extended many of these bargaining rights, or unions in California have issued court cases and grievances through the NLRB that have shown that these collective bargaining rights apply to you whether you are documented or undocumented. Essentially, my colleague Abel Valenzuela, who used to study day labor, some of the rulings there have found that once you enter even a verbal contract agreement, that supersedes your immigration status. So if you, as a day laborer, someone picks you up at Home Depot, they take you out, have you paint their living room, and then they refuse to pay you, that day laborer has a case because they have rights to the contract that preempts their immigration rights. It doesn't matter if you're not supposed to be in the country or illegal. If you've entered into a contract and someone owes you money, you can do that. But the mechanisms to pursue those damages, right, which, as I was describing before, happen sometimes at the state level, but also happen at the national level. In the state of California, for example, our labor commissioner has prioritized wage theft. She has gone after repeat offenders. She has gotten more back. We have won back millions of dollars of unpaid wages for workers, regardless of their immigration status. About 19,000 claims, as far as I remember, in 2023. That's a very small portion of the actual wage theft that is being committed, because so many people are vulnerable, or they don't have the resources, or their housing unstable. And so they miss the forms that are sent back and forth. You have like 30 days to produce a bunch of documentation. If you can't produce that, your case is thrown out. Weaning these agencies of their funding, as you described with the NLRB, is one way to effectively gum up those works completely, right? If you only have 3 inspectors to pursue wage theft claims and you're getting 100,000 claims, those 3 inspectors effectively can't do their jobs and can't implement the law. So what you're doing when you're scaring the shit out of undocumented workers is you're discouraging them from pursuing any kind of remediation that way. You're essentially creating a hyper exploitable underground labor force that they do want to maintain. They want that underclass. They know they need that underclass. There was a recent dust up in the state of Florida, for example, where Ron DeSantis had dueling bills with his state level government. Again, no Department of Labor in Florida, remember that, about how they were going to enforce immigration law. Big ag, agricultural providers know they rely on that labor. They're not going to completely remove that labor force. What they're going to do is make it harder for that labor force to speak up when their wages are stolen, to protest against abusive employers, to file any kind of claims of grievances for that kind of abusive behavior, and effectively force them to eat shit. I mean, if I'm being so oblique, just take it and eat shit is kind of the attitude here. So I just think that's an important thing, to see these as 2 pieces in the puzzle. If we take them at their word, they want to remove all undocumented folks from this country. They know that's not possible at our current scale. So instead, what they want to do is make people so vulnerable and so scared that they'll never assert their rights, and they will just accept whatever kind of abusive behavior that they're getting. It also invites elements of human trafficking into the mix, because now workers will be increasingly the problem with guest labor programs, for example. I know there's been this debate about high-skilled visas versus guest worker visas. Anytime your right to be in the country is attached to employer, you're inviting exploitation and abuse. It is very difficult. When Elon Musk made his staffing cuts at Twitter, he laid off 80% of the staff. The only people who stayed were H-1B visa holders, because H-1B visa holders depend on Twitter for their right to be in the country. So they're unlikely to speak up when they're asked to work 80-hour weeks, asked to sleep in the office, asked whatever the hell he's asking them to do. So I think it's important that we see these two pieces as part of the same puzzle, which is effectively to create, as there was in early 20th century Los Angeles, kind of a two-tiered labor system where there's a small elite class of, quote, high-skilled workers. These are the kind of workers that were drawn to Trump, right? The unions that had the most Trump support were ones like miners, steel workers, where there is a kind of class of highly skilled, highly valued, mostly white workers, right? They're paid a wage, but they're fairly well compensated and have, relatively good jobs, often union protected jobs. And then this vast underclass of undocumented, disenfranchised, historically underrepresented workers who are effectively being told that you will have no rights to complain about your work ever again. And so I think when we think about the working class, that conversation in their mind's eye is one that is rooted in images of big burly dudes in hard hats and work boots, when in the reality, most American workers today, in Los Angeles it's 78%, I'm not sure what it is nationally, work in service sector employment. There are 9 million retail workers in this country. There are 38,000 coal miners. So when they talk about the working class, what they are talking about is coal miners, is these kind of old-fashioned modes of what we think of when we think of a worker, that fails to recognize that most workers, most wage earners in the United States today are working in service sector work, whether that be retail, food service, hospitality, education, healthcare. Service sector worker includes real estate agent and hedge fund guys too, right? That's also service provision. Dentists, doctors, they are service providers. But the industrial workforce, as they define it, the working class in their mind's eye, is a much slimmer swath of workers for whom their sort of unions tend to function almost as guilds, where it's this very smaller batch of workers, and their unions protect their high wages and relatively good working conditions in industries that are ostensibly trying to displace them with automation. So what that is designed to do, as it did in the early 20th century, is to divide the working class. It is structurally designed to create hierarchies within this wage earning section of society and pit those against one another. And often that higher skilled, mostly white, mostly male class of workers is being persuaded with kind of entrepreneurial language. You can become a small business owner, you can become a homeowner, get your big truck, that kind of stuff. Whereas this underclass is being demonized and presented as someone who is taking from those high skilled workers. It's a game as old as time. It's been happening throughout the economy for many, many years. And I think that it invites us all to have a new conversation about what our socioeconomic hierarchy actually looks like in the United States, what our economy actually looks like in the United States, and new ways of thinking. I lost you again. I find it really compelling, some of the work that the Debt Collective is doing about reorienting us to the debtors class and to think about people for whom debt is a sort of defining feature of their reality. You and I have talked before about precarity being a new kind of vector of understanding class, that those of us who are rent burdened, who live paycheck to paycheck, whether we be teachers, plumbers, what have you, are all sort of, it's a new way of orienting yourself to what it means to be working class. But I think, frankly, that what these men are doing is designed to create that division so that we can't all get together and recognize that they are a rising oligarchy that is not our friend.
Yeah, let's go a little deeper into that, because I had this sort of theory about how they're communicating this, I think is interesting. So I think Reagan really normalized the Republican plan, which is if you come out against popular programs, you get pushback. But if you just defund them and they fail to work, then eventually the public gets on your side and opposes the program because it's not working for them. So I think there's a little bit of that going on with the NLRB, because I was, initially kind of surprised at Donald Trump's appointment of Representative Lori Chavez-DeRemer. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. Because she had been one of the few Republicans who had voted for the PRO Act. She had worked at Planned Parenthood. And, as far as Congress people go, or Republicans in Congress go, it's, probably one of the best people on labor. I know it's kind of like the nicest guy in prison. But so when it came to the appointment, what do you make of that? Because I make of that as this was an appointment where he could give a nod to like organized labor, like the Sean Fains of the world, and say like, look, here's a pro-labor congressperson, but really behind the scenes, we're gutting the entire thing so it can't do anything.
Yes, I think that's the correct take. I mean, another thing to keep in mind is it's not just the NLRB that is enforcing workers' rights. They are specifically focused on collective bargaining and bargaining process with unions. But remember, that's a very small portion of the population that is actually in unions or interested in organizing unions. So the statistic I usually share with my students, or the agency that I often focus on, is the agency that is responsible for enforcing the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is the Department of Labor's Wages and Hours Division. The Wages and Hours Division often goes kind of unnoticed. It's sort of humble, quote unquote, career bureaucrats who are enforcing the law there. But they are responsible for ensuring that every American is paid the minimum wage, that people are following the rules of overtime, right? That they're submitting appropriate paperwork. One of the things the Fair Labor Standards Act do that I think often gets overlooked is it actually creates the W-2, right? You can't enforce labor law if you don't know who's an employee of what company. So the reason we have all these paperwork requirements and reporting requirements is for that procedure. So when the Department of Labor and Wages and Hours Division, in the immediate post-war era, when labor was kind of at its peak, when you had the highest density in unions, they employed about 1,000 investigators, which functionally worked out to being, I think it's one investigator for like every 22,000 workers, 22.5, I think is the total, right? So one inspector for every 22.5 employees. That's a pretty reasonable number in terms of workload. By 1986, in the Reagan administration, he had slashed that workforce because remember, you don't even necessarily have to cut those jobs. You just have to not increase those jobs, right? The number of workers goes up. And if you don't proportionately increase the number of inspectors, you've effectively denuded the agency. So by 1986, you had one inspector for every 99,000 workers. Then under Clinton, I'm not letting him off the hook here, they cut it even further. And so by 2015, there were under 900 investigators, which doesn't sound like a huge cut, right? 1,000 versus 900, that's not that big a deal. Well, the workforce had grown to 135 million people from 22 million. So you're talking about one inspector for like every 140,000 employees. And that's just functionally impossible for that person to do the work. By Nixon, the statistic that pops out in my mind is at current staffing levels, it would take OSHA inspectors 135 years to investigate every worksite in the United States. They've done this with agriculture. They've done this with virtually every one of these administrative agencies. So defunded the agency, so denuded the workforce and its enforcement capacity that effectively they're letting self-governance. And I believe that's actually the policy of USDA when it comes to food inspection, is they actually let companies hire their own inspector and report to the USDA. So there's this whole micro industry of private sector people who are like, oh yeah, I'll inspect your farm, sure. And then we wonder why we have a bird flu epidemic. I think that's why I draw our attention to this pattern that is repeated across these agencies. This is an attack on the administrative state. This is an attack on the ability of the federal government to enforce anything, any standards of anything. So one way you can do that is you can strip the regulation entirely. I remember Trump's performance with his big stack of folders last time around, where he had all these weird fold. He loves a prop. Anyways, he came out and he's like, look at all these things I cut. So one way is to just cut it completely. Number two is to create some giant loophole you can drive a truck through. That basically makes the regulation completely incapacitated. But I'm really glad you're lifting up this issue, because it's one I always talk about with my students, is you can also just starve that agency of funds. And then there can be rules on the book, but they're just completely unenforced. So that's what I see happening both in the NLRB itself, but also in the Department of Labor broadly. And I think you're right to say that you can put a shiny face on that project. I mean, look what Marco Rubio has done. Marco Rubio was 99 senators vote for him because he seems like a reasonable guy, but he's presiding over what is incredibly unreasonable behavior, and he's sort of doing it with a smile. I think we can expect the same with the Department of Labor. I think it was beautiful and wonderful that so many workers showed up to try to prevent them in the building. I think it was amazing that several major unions sued to try to protect the privacy of their members when it came to whatever Elon and his chuds are up to in these agencies. But I think that the truth is, whatever he's doing is going to be followed by just such a massive defunding that you can't effectively do anything with these agencies. And then they're following that with court cases that are structurally designed to completely disempower the administrative state. It is a really scary, frightening acceleration of trends that we have been seeing for years and years and years that are now being forced through. And the truth is, they could never pass this if it was legislation. They would never be able to pass a bill that said, we want to defund the wages and hours division so that the minimum wage is effectively gone. No, the American public, including those white workers who were super persuaded, and it's not just white workers, there are men of color who are also part of this kind of, we are the working class type of self-image. None of them believed that they wanted to get rid of the minimum wage. Well, that's effectively what they're doing. So I think that part of this is about our civic illiteracy as a nation. We really don't understand. I blow my students' minds with these kinds of facts because they just don't really understand how any of this works. And to me, this being a podcast about sort of media and the way we talk about these things, that is because the media's failures to do that kind of political education about how these processes actually work. The other thing I just want to say is that all those dollars, this is a fundamental miseducation that the media is doing a terrible job about. All those dollars are people. So something like 200,000 federal workers have already lost their job. It does not help our economy to have 200,000 workers all of a sudden out of work. When you strip $900 million out of the American economy, you are causing a recession on purpose. And so it's the connecting of those dots that I find to be the most frustrating about the media's conversation right now. And this is particularly true of the New York Times, this kind of at a distance cerebral version of what is happening here being about principles of democracy and not connecting the dollars and cents of all of that to the people on the ground that are going to suffer here. It is a catastrophic failure of civic illiteracy that those of us that work in the space of education have been noticing for quite some time now. Just basic civics education about how all this stuff works is our students they don't even sort of think about it. So that's why I wanted to start by just providing about like what the NLRB actually does, like what its constituent parts are, because I think in some ways that system that has been in place since 1935 has been undermined and eroded, but right now we've got two adult babies smashing it like they would their toys, and they don't understand what they're breaking. They don't understand what they're smashing.
Caroline, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. I got to have you back on because I want to talk to you about data privacy and AI in terms of later. But as we as we close up here, where can folks follow your work, and what's any advice you have to people who are thinking about these issues in the moment? Maybe places they can go, things they can do. What say you?
Well, so I have a couple registers of things that I think we can do right now. I think one of these things is storytelling and narrative. That's why I said yes to this invitation. I think we need people to stop abstracting things on principle, stop the leopard face party. I know I referenced that before, but there's a lot of smugness coming from a lot of people when it comes to, but I didn't vote for this. Like, that doesn't get us anywhere to point out that people don't understand what they voted for. It doesn't help us. I think we all need to be able to talk about these issues by laying plain the crass greed that is under all of it. There was a congressman from Texas who was on the floor of the House the other day. I saw a clip of him, forgive me for not remembering his name, who laid it plain. Elon Musk's company get $8 million a day from the federal government. Your average Social Security recipient gets $65 a day. So who is the welfare queen in this situation, right? Who is the one extracting value from the American taxpayer? I don't think it's the Social Security person getting $65 a day. I think in terms of academia, the register of that is that we need to explain the value of our labor. We need to defend the value of our labor. Researchers need to be able to explain what their work helps us to do as a society and what it will mean to lose that research. And I've been seeing these just stories that you're like, what the hell? Why would you want to get rid of someone who's studying infertility treatments? Why would you want to get rid of someone who's studying childhood cancer? It is our job to create that kind of civic literacy that the mainstream media will not provide, of connecting those dots about how our universities run. And we need to do it for a broad audience, but we also need to do it for each other, to really get each other to see how interconnected we are. I mean, the UC, if our hospitals go down, it's going to take the whole university down with us. And that's going to be devastating. So, really trying to people this story by talking about the 200,000 people who have lost their jobs, not the abstract numbers that none of us can make sense of. Like $900 million is such an unfathomable amount of money that we can't get our hands around that. But 200,000 people, that is a much more legible consequence that we can think about. And then the second thing I'd say is just, we need to recognize that this is not an epiphenomenal thing. I mean, that's kind of why I referenced that this has been a sort of gradual process. We've kind of been sleepwalking through what has been a longer, slower boil attack on our rights as workers and on the rights of our colleagues, and not really paying attention to it. I mean, I'm so glad you referenced the lawsuit that's also happening alongside this, because that's been happening for years. And it's going to go through. It is going to succeed. There are several justices on the Supreme Court that have made it very clear that they are absolutely chomping at the bit to destroy the administrative state. And so we need to start preparing on the flip side. So, this sounds kind of haughty, but it's like, listen to the advocates in your community that understand what's happening now. And try to lift up those voices. And I really appreciate that you're doing that, Nolan. I don't have a lot to promote right now. The book is coming. There will be more updates on that. I do have a website. You can Google me and find me there. But, I would say, instead of following me, figure out where your union is. Figure out if you have an AAUP chapter on your campus. Figure out if you and your coworkers have a bargaining unit that you can join. Get or plug in with a local immigrant defense organization in your area. There are sort of ICE watches and various forms of mutual aid that you can help with right now. People have been doing this work for many, many years, and there's no reason to feel like you have to reinvent the wheel to get involved right now. Join up, give them your money, give them your time, and get in the fight, because this is a very, very pivotal moment. And if we don't take it, we're going to be lost. So.
Thank you so much, Caroline Luce, and we'll definitely have you back again. And thank you all for listening.
Hey, Detoxers. Thanks again for tuning in. Make sure to like, subscribe, and follow Disinfo Detox wherever you get your podcasts. Detox complete.